The late afternoon sun stretched long, golden fingers across Maplewood Lane, casting shadows that seemed to linger like sentinels. The street was quiet, almost unnervingly so. Each house stood in its own perfection, lawns trimmed with surgical precision, flower beds that looked as if they had been painted on, mailboxes matching in immaculate hunter green. And at the very corner, presiding over her realm with unchallenged authority, lived Karen Whitmore. Karen Whitmore was a force of nature disguised as a suburban homeowner. She had the kind of presence that made neighbors straighten their backs involuntarily when she passed. 15 years she had lived on that corner lot, enforcing the rules of the HOA like a general defending her fortress. She didn't just follow the rules, she was the rules. No one had ever dared cross her. Until now. I first noticed the house next to hers about a month ago. It had been sitting vacant for years, its once proud shutters peeling, paint flaking, and lawn overrun with wild grass. It looked forgotten. Something about that decay whispered freedom to me, a contrast to the sterile perfection of the Whitmore estate. I imagined walking through the creaking front door, owning a space that wasn't dictated by someone else's obsession with conformity. When I finally signed the papers, a thrill unlike any other coursed through me. This was mine. Every square inch of it. Not a house as a showpiece, not a house as a reflection of some arbitrary standard, but a home that I could shape that would shape me back. I could hang curtains that clashed with the neighbor's beige obsession, plant sunflowers that leaned recklessly into the sun, and not have a single person wag their finger in judgment. I hadn't unpacked more than a couple of boxes when I saw her. The SUV screeched to a halt in front of her house, tires whining against the asphalt. Out stepped Karen Whitmore, dressed in the suburban uniform of stiff blouse, pearl earrings, and an expression carved from marble. Her hands landed firmly on her hips, stance wide, eyes narrowed like laser beams trained directly on me. It was the first true confrontation, and I felt, instantly, that I was staring down a storm. "Excuse me." Her voice sliced through the calm like a whip. "You cannot live here. Ever." I froze mid-step, a cardboard box clutched in my arms. The sheer audacity of it was breathtaking. Her tone left no room for negotiation or discussion, it was a command. I just bought this house," I said carefully, trying to mask my surprise with polite firmness. "It's mine now." Karen's lips pressed into a thin, angry line. "Not according to me," she spat. "You're not part of the HOA, which means you're not allowed here. It disrupts the community, the aesthetic." She waved her hands dramatically, as if words could summon laws that didn't exist. I set the box down, laughing softly at the absurdity. "You do realize that I bought the house, right? That gives me legal ownership. You don't get to veto it." Her face shifted through a kaleidoscope of rage, disbelief, and indignation. You can't live here. Do you even understand what you're doing to the neighborhood?" At that moment, I realized something crucial. Karen Whitmore was not simply a woman who loved order. She was a force of nature, a hurricane in sensible shoes, and she had just discovered a loose thread in her tightly woven world. And she would do everything in her power to tear it out. The following days were surreal. She made rounds every morning, clipboard in hand, taking notes as if she were documenting a crime scene. The first encounter was calm compared to what came next. She began a campaign of thinly veiled threats, passive-aggressive notes slipped under my door, and a scrutiny that bordered on obsession. "Unacceptable," one note read. "Do better," read another. The smallest details, my mailbox color, the type of mulch in the flower bed, even the way my curtains swayed, were judged with meticulous severity. The neighbors watched from behind lace curtains, whispering and speculating. Some pitied me. Some clearly enjoyed the spectacle. I realized quickly that in this part of town, no one had ever challenged Karen Whitmore. They lived under her invisible rule, afraid to disrupt the delicate balance of their curated lives. But I wasn't afraid. In fact, the audacity of her outrage gave me a strange thrill. Here was a woman who had built an empire out of rules, a queen of conformity, and she had just been handed an insurrection in the form of one small, independent human being. I responded in the only way that felt right. I kept my own pace, unapologetic and deliberate. I mowed the lawn, not in her image, but in mine. I painted the shutters a muted, tasteful gray, not to provoke, not to appease, but to assert my presence. I planted wildflowers in corners of the yard, bright splashes of color where none had dared bloom. Every morning I woke to see her staring through the blinds, her eyes tracking my every move like a hawk circling its prey. One evening, she lingered longer than usual. Standing at the edge of her driveway, her arms crossed, she glared through my living room window. I caught her reflection in the glass, framed by the dim light, and for a moment, I felt the raw intensity of her scrutiny and almost tangible weight pressing down on my shoulders. "You'll regret this," she whispered. Not loud, not a command for me to hear, but a promise, a foreshadowing of battles yet to come. I didn't answer. I only poured myself a glass of wine, lifted it to the window in a silent toast, and smiled. She did not return the gesture. That night, as I unpacked the last of the kitchen boxes, I thought about the life I had just claimed. A house is more than walls and a roof, it is a declaration. My declaration was simple: I would not be ruled by fear, by perfection, by a woman who believed that control over her corner of the world entitled her to control mine. Maplewood Lane had its queen, yes, but she had just met her first worthy opponent. And from that moment on, nothing would ever be the same. The sun had set, casting a soft purple haze over the rooftops. I stood at the front window, surveying my new domain. Across the street, Karen Whitmore's house gleamed in perfect, unyielding order, an unspoken challenge in white trim and manicured hedges. And I knew, with a thrill that coursed through my veins, that our war was just beginning. I would fight with patience, wit, and resolve. And perhaps most importantly, I would never, ever back down. The morning sun barely filtered through the dense leaves of Maplewood Lane when I first saw her that day, Karen Whitmore, the human hurricane, back in full force. Her white SUV squealed to a stop in front of her perfectly trimmed hedge, tires grinding against the asphalt as if the street itself were an adversary. She emerged, clipboard clutched tightly, eyes sharp and calculating, every step deliberate, predatory. I had been sipping my coffee on the front porch, a rare moment of calm after the chaos of the previous week, and I felt her arrival in my bones before I even heard her voice. "Morning," I called cheerfully, hoping that a friendly tone might diffuse her fury. She did not acknowledge it. Not even a nod. Instead, she strode up the driveway, her gaze sweeping across my yard with an intensity that made the grass seem suddenly guilty. "You," she hissed. "Yes, you. This monstrosity is an affront. I've already contacted the HOA board. They're coming over to assess the damage you're doing to our neighborhood." I laughed softly, a sound of disbelief more than amusement. "You do realize this house isn't even in your HOA, right? None of this applies here." Karen's lips thinned into a line of rage. "It's about principle," she snapped. "Order. Community. Standards. You can't just ruin it for everyone else." I set down my coffee cup, choosing calm over confrontation for the moment. "Karen, I'm not trying to ruin anything. I bought this house. I'm going to live here. That's my right." For a moment, her fury seemed to falter, replaced by disbelief. Then, like a storm regaining momentum, it returned, louder and sharper than before. You can't just take what you want. You don't understand the chaos you're bringing." This wasn't just about property lines anymore. This was a full-blown declaration of war. And I realized, with a thrill and a twinge of fear, that Karen Whitmore had never met resistance in her life. Not like this. The next week became a masterclass in absurd suburban warfare. Notes appeared, taped to my door, each one more bizarre and obsessive than the last. "Unacceptable." One demanded, scrawled in angry block letters. "Do better." Read another, the ink still wet. One day, I found tiny garden gnomes lined up along the edge of my lawn, each facing my house as though standing vigil against my audacity. Karen herself became a constant presence, appearing unannounced at all hours. Morning jogs past my driveway, evenings spent glaring through the blinds of her living room across the street, she tracked me like a hawk tracking prey. The neighbors whispered behind curtains, casting glances both sympathetic and amused. No one had ever dared challenge her. And now, in the middle of their well-manicured world, a storm had arrived. Despite the tension, I refused to be intimidated. I kept my daily routines as though nothing had changed. I mowed the lawn, painted the shutters a muted gray, and planted wildflowers in clusters along the walkway, bright, defiant splashes of color that refused to conform. Every morning, I noticed her standing in her driveway, arms crossed, eyes narrowed, studying every choice I made. Her scrutiny was relentless. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in a bloody mixture of crimson and gold, I caught her reflection in my living room window. She stood at the edge of her yard, lips pressed into a thin line, fists clenched at her sides. It was not a friendly neighborly glance, it was a calculated inspection, a silent declaration of war. "You'll regret this," she whispered, almost to herself. Not to me, but I could hear it. And in that whisper, I sensed a promise: the chaos had only begun. True to form, the escalation was immediate. That weekend, she organized what she called a neighborhood meeting, summoning anyone within earshot to critique my home. Flyers appeared on doors: "Attention residents, unauthorized property adjacent to Maplewood Lane." Some neighbors peered from behind lace curtains, others took notes, unsure whether to intervene or simply watch the drama unfold. Karen stood at the center, clipboard in hand, barking orders with an authority that was almost theatrical in its intensity. She tried everything. She called local media, attempting to frame my existence as a public menace. She called code enforcement, claiming violations that didn't exist. Once, she even tried to block my driveway with her SUV in a maneuver so absurd it would have been comical if it weren't so frustrating. Through it all, I maintained a delicate balance of composure. I never shouted back, never made a scene, though inside I simmered with a mix of anger, amusement, and disbelief. The audacity of her campaign amazed me, but I had learned something crucial in those first tense days: Karen thrived on reaction. She fed on conflict. So I denied her the satisfaction of outrage. I acted calmly, almost politely, and watched the storm unfold without letting it sweep me away. Neighbors whispered, some approaching cautiously. "Are you really going to let her get away with this?" one asked, eyes wide. I smiled faintly. I didn't buy this house to obey her. I bought it to live here. That means standing my ground. One evening, the confrontation reached its peak. I was trimming a wild patch of sunflowers that had grown taller than my fence when she stormed across the lawn, SUV parked haphazardly at the curb, arms flailing like a general commanding an army. "You will leave," she screamed, stomping her foot. "I am not asking anymore." I paused, garden shears in hand, standing my ground. "Karen, you don't get to decide who lives here. You've had 15 years of control, and I respect that, but this house is mine. You cannot intimidate me into submission." Her chest heaved, and for a moment, it seemed as if she might collapse under the weight of her own fury. Then, in a final desperate act, she waved a stack of freshly printed HOA letters like a banner of authority. I took a deep breath, choosing a strategy she never expected. I smiled, put down the shears, and extended an invitation. "Come inside," I said. Her eyes widened, and she froze mid-lunge, letters still clutched in her trembling hands. "Let's talk." For a moment, I thought she might explode. She had never been invited into a home she did not control. Slowly, cautiously, she stepped over the threshold, as if entering enemy territory. Her gaze scanned the living room as though every corner might contain a trap. She did not sit. She remained standing, tense and rigid, a living embodiment of the storm I had entered. "I don't want to argue," I said calmly, measuring every word. "I don't want war. But I do want peace. You love your community, I get it. But I'm living here now, and I intend to stay. We can coexist, or we can escalate this endlessly. The choice is yours." Karen's hands trembled at her sides, lips pressed together in a way I had never seen before. Her eyes darted around, assessing, weighing, calculating. The silence stretched between us, thick with tension, suspense, and unspoken battle lines. Finally, she exhaled, a soft, almost imperceptible sigh. I just want order," she muttered. "And you can have it," I said gently. "Just, not at my expense. Your house, your rules. My house, my rules. That's how neighbors live side by side without constant conflict. Her shoulders slumped slightly, and for the first time, I saw the woman behind the armor. Not the unstoppable queen of HOA, not the unyielding enforcer, but just a person, afraid of change, clinging to control. The tension did not vanish, but it shifted. From threat to truce, from fury to wary observation. We had reached an unspoken agreement, neither would dominate the other. I returned to the garden, hands dirty, sunflowers swaying gently in the evening breeze. Maplewood Lane had changed, subtly but irrevocably. A new dynamic had entered the neighborhood, a challenge to the established order. And as I looked across the street at her perfect, gleaming house, I understood that the war was far from over, but I was ready. This was my space, my home, my freedom. And I would defend it quietly, patiently, and without compromise. The weekend air was thick with tension. Maplewood Lane, usually a haven of suburban calm, seemed to hum with anticipation, as if the street itself knew something monumental was about to unfold. Across the cul-de-sac, Karen Whitmore's white SUV gleamed in the morning sun, parked with military precision. She emerged, clipboard clutched like a shield, eyes scanning my yard as though it were enemy territory. By now, the neighborhood had grown accustomed to her daily inspections, her uninvited guidance, and her escalating attempts to assert control. Flyers had appeared on mailboxes, unauthorized property adjacent to Maplewood Lane. Protect our neighborhood. And yet, no matter how many threats she issued, no matter how many rules she tried to conjure out of thin air, I remained unmoved. I was planting tulips along the front walkway, the soil cool and damp beneath my hands, when she stormed across the lawn. The sun caught her hair in a halo of fury, making her look more like a goddess of suburban judgment than a mortal neighbor. "You will leave," she screamed, stomping her foot as though the earth itself should rise to enforce her decree. "I am not asking anymore." I straightened, hands smudged with dirt, meeting her glare with calm defiance. "Karen," I said evenly, "you don't get to decide who lives here. I respect that you love your community, but this is my home now. I am staying. You cannot intimidate me into leaving." Her chest heaved, fingers gripping the clipboard so tightly that the paper crinkled beneath her knuckles. For a moment, she seemed paralyzed, as though she were confronting a force she had never anticipated. Then, with a final cry of fury, she waved a stack of printed HOA letters in the air, as if to summon an army of imaginary enforcers. I took a deep breath and did something unexpected. I smiled, laid down the trowel, and extended a hand. "Come inside," I said. Her eyes widened in disbelief. No one had ever invited her in. Not a neighbor, not a rival, no one. Her entire existence was built on commanding from a distance, on rules enforced with fear rather than diplomacy. Slowly, cautiously, she stepped across the threshold, clipboard still in hand, scanning every corner as if it might conceal some trap. "I don't want to argue," I said, my voice steady. "I don't want a war. But I do want peace. You care about your neighborhood, I get it. I respect that. But I'm living here now, and I intend to stay. We can escalate this endlessly, or we can coexist. The choice is yours." For a long moment, she said nothing. The silence was thick, almost palpable, charged with the weight of every confrontation we had endured over the past weeks. Then, finally, a faint sigh escaped her lips. I just want order," she whispered, the rigidity in her stance softening ever so slightly. "And you can have it," I replied. "But not at my expense. Your house, your rules. My house, my rules. That's how neighbors live side by side without constant conflict." Her hands fell to her sides, trembling faintly. For the first time, I saw beyond the armor she had constructed for herself. Beneath the rage, beneath the obsession with control, was a woman afraid of change, afraid of losing the order she had built for so long. We stood in silence, each of us measuring the other, testing the fragile truce that had taken weeks to reach. Finally, Karen lowered her clipboard, a gesture small but monumental, as though she had surrendered a battle without losing her dignity entirely. I suppose we can try that," she said quietly. It was not a victory in the traditional sense. Karen Whitmore had not transformed overnight, she was still a force to be reckoned with. But it was a start. And in that moment, the war shifted from open confrontation to quiet coexistence. In the following days, the neighborhood watched closely. Karen resumed her patrols but with less intensity, her eyes softer, less accusatory. I maintained my routines, keeping my garden lively and my shutters uniquely mine. And slowly, a strange equilibrium emerged, a balance between her obsessive order and my insistence on independence. One morning, I stepped out to find her standing at the edge of her yard, watching me plant a small row of lavender along the fence. She did not speak. She did not gesture. She simply observed, and for the first time, her gaze lacked hostility. I waved tentatively. She hesitated, then waved back, a small, stiff motion, but a motion nonetheless. It was a breakthrough, subtle yet powerful. The neighborhood had been expecting fireworks, the ultimate clash of wills. Instead, they witnessed something far rarer, the grudging acceptance of boundaries, a recognition that coexistence was possible even when principles seemed irreconcilable. In the weeks that followed, Maplewood Lane settled into a new rhythm. Karen Whitmore continued her routines, but the intensity of her scrutiny waned. I kept my garden vibrant, my shutters unconventional, my home a testament to personal freedom. And in return, she allowed it to exist, her obsession redirected back to her own corner of the street. Neighbors began to approach me cautiously, offering tips, sharing smiles, even laughing quietly about the absurdity of our suburban war. Some admitted they had feared me, expected me to buckle under Karen's relentless campaign. But I had learned early on that resistance did not require confrontation, it required patience, consistency, and the quiet assertion of one's own right to exist. One evening, as the sun dipped low, casting warm amber light across the cul-de-sac, I stood on my porch, surveying the street. Karen's house gleamed across the road, a fortress of order, yet no longer a threat. She was a presence, certainly, but not a tyrant. And my home, the one I had claimed amidst tension and defiance, felt more alive than ever. I reflected on the weeks that had passed, the notes, the inspections, the furious outbursts, the absurd gestures of control. It had been exhausting, relentless, and at times infuriating. But through it all, I had discovered something essential, not just about Karen, not just about suburban life, but about myself. Owning a house is about more than property. It is about claiming a space where your values, choices, and freedoms are respected. It is about standing firm in the face of unreasonable opposition. And sometimes, it is about extending a hand, even to the fiercest opponent, and finding a path to coexistence. That evening, I poured myself a glass of wine, stepping onto the porch. Across the street, Karen Whitmore's silhouette was framed in the soft glow of her living room light. She was still there, watching, still vigilant. But the storm had lost its fury, the war had found its boundary. And I smiled, feeling the quiet triumph that came not from defeating an enemy, but from securing your own freedom. Maplewood Lane would never be the same, but that was okay. Neither would I. And in the strange, delicate balance between order and independence, I had found something rarer than victory, peace. I turned back to the fading sunlight, inhaling the scent of lavender and tulips, the sound of distant children playing, and the subtle hum of a neighborhood slowly returning to life. Karen Whitmore remained a formidable presence, yes, but she had met her match in patience, resolve, and quiet defiance. And for the first time since I arrived, I truly felt at home.